Good day. This is Voice of the Voiceless, and I am Dan Kovalik, the host. Today I'd like to talk about the issue of what has come known I'm going to start over. Good day. Welcome to Voice of the Voiceless. I'm your host, Dan Kovalik.
Cut.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you put your butt up against the back of the seat?
Yeah.
Oh, it's the book. In the book. It was the book.
Were you getting a glare?
It just looked like your clothes.
I see. Okay.
Where do you want it? It was just weird. It looked like his clothes. I don't know. It was just a weird. He just had it in a weird spot. Okay. Yeah. All right. Once again, anytime you're ready.
Okay. Good day and welcome. This is Voice of the Voiceless, and I'm your host, Dan Kovalik. Today I want to talk about an issue which is more relevant, I think, than ever, and that is what has come to be known as humanitarian interventionism. In fact, I wrote a book about it called No More War: How the West Violates International Law by Using Humanitarian Intervention to Advance Economic and Strategic Interests. So what is humanitarian interventionism? Even if you don't know the term, you probably understand the concept. The concept being that particularly the United States goes to war and intervenes in other countries in order to protect human rights and humanitarian concerns. Probably the most notable case recently that was explicitly a humanitarian intervention was the NATO foray into Libya in 2011. Of course, President Obama led the charge for the United States in that invasion, that bombing raid that lasted between March and October of 2011. But at least according to various sources, including the New York Times, apparently he was pushed into this or encouraged to participate in the NATO bombing by three individuals who have helped develop the concept of humanitarian interventionism over the years. And those are Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, who's back in the Biden administration and who worked in the Clinton administration as well, and the Obama administration, and Samantha Power, an interesting figure who won a Pulitzer Prize, became famous for her book that won a Pulitzer Prize. It's called A Problem from Hell, which is a case study of genocide. And the main thesis is how these genocides happen in other places of the world. And according to Ms. Power, it's up to the West, and especially the U.S., to intervene to stop these genocides. Based on the strength of that book, she became an important person in the Obama administration. She was Obama's ambassador to the United Nations, and in that role, she helped push for the attack on Libya, which, again, was based on the claim that we were there to protect human rights. The fact is that that humanitarian intervention, like nearly all alleged humanitarian interventions, was based on lies. Those pushing for the intervention claimed, for example, that Muammar Gaddafi, who was the leader of Libya at the time the invasion started, was giving Viagra to his troops to carry out mass rapes of the population. And this was reported with all seriousness. In fact, this was later debunked by Amnesty International, which said that they couldn't find one person who was a witness to this claim. There was also the claim that Muammar Gaddafi was going to commit genocide in Benghazi. Again, in the end, there was no serious evidence that that was going to happen. In fact, Gaddafi had offered for the UN observers to go to Benghazi to look for themselves to see what was happening in order to prevent the bombing of Libya. And those observers never were able to do their job because the bombing happened without their report. And then the final claim, which was the most insidious of all, was the claim that Gaddafi was using black mercenaries, and that was the word they used, from other countries in Africa to carry out war crimes against his own population. Amnesty International originally reported on that claim and claimed it was true, and others claimed it was true. Again, later Amnesty International would admit that that wasn't true, but it was after the bombing had already started. In fact, as everyone agrees now, there were no black mercenaries, but there were African guest workers who were working in Libya at the time. They were not fighting, they were working, they were construction workers. And there were black people living in Libya for generations and who still live there. And these three lies combined help pave the way for this so-called humanitarian intervention. Again, the lie about the black mercenaries was the most dangerous one, because what it did was not only pave the way for the invasion of Libya, which has left Libya in tatters to this day, but it actually encouraged the jihadists that the West was working with to overthrow Gaddafi to go after people with black skin in Libya. And they did that. They arrested black Libyans and black guest workers in large numbers, killed them in large numbers, engaged in ethnic cleansing of black residents of whole towns, thousands of people from their towns. And now, for the first time in living memory, Libya has slave markets in which black people, mostly from sub-Saharan Africa, are being sold on the streets for about $400 as slaves. This was not happening before the invasion. And so what we see is that this alleged humanitarian intervention was anything but that. It, in fact, made the human rights situation worse in Libya. And we know from emails, which I detail, again, in this book, No More War, we know from emails, particularly within the Hillary Clinton team, that they didn't even believe it was about human rights, that they acknowledged that any human rights concerns had passed by the time the NATO bombing had begun. But Hillary Clinton's chief advisor on this, Sidney Blumenthal, said they should nonetheless go ahead with the bombing, for one, to help Obama in the polls, that having a war under his belt would help him win another election, which was coming up in 2012. And also indicated that there were a number of other interests which could be gained by overthrowing Gaddafi, including, Libya's rich oil reserves. He mentioned that Italy had its own interests in overthrowing Gaddafi. For example, the Italian government had signed an agreement with Gaddafi, agreeing for reparations to be given to Libya from Italy for its abuses during Italy's colonial occupation of Libya. So Italy wanted to get rid of Gaddafi so that they could rip up that agreement, which they did. France, in particular, Nicolas Sarkozy, who was president at the time, wanted Gaddafi dead because Gaddafi was a witness to a crime that, by the way, Sarkozy is now in jail for, and that was that Gaddafi had given $50 million to Muammar Gaddafi for his presidential election bid, which was illegal under French law. So Sarkozy wanted him dead to get rid of a witness against him. You know, it's an old-time mafia hit, really. Blumenthal also mentions Gaddafi's huge gold reserves, which he said France was particularly interested in. So this had nothing to do with humanitarianism. This was an old-time colonial attack on an African country which had disastrous results. But the interesting thing about the invasion of Libya was that many liberals supported that invasion. You know, people like Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! Cheer-led that operation. You know, certainly NPR did, the New York Times, even liberal, you know, writers like Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times supported it. And now you hear almost nothing about Libya. Why? Because it's an inconvenient truth of what happened, and that is that NATO destroyed a very stable, prosperous African country, leveled civilian cities like Sirte to the ground, killed untold numbers of civilians in the process, and set Libya back probably centuries. And to me, that's one of the best examples of humanitarian interventionism that one can look to. And the fact it happened under Obama, whose vice president was, of course, our current president, Joe Biden, has to give you pause that, in fact, a humanitarian intervention could be just around the corner. One place where this notion comes up, for example, is in discussions about Afghanistan. Now, Biden has said, or is about to say, I guess, announced that the U.S. is going to pull troops out of Afghanistan after 20 years of being there on the ground, and that he's going to do so by the anniversary of September 11th. So September 11, 2021. And hopefully that will happen. In my view, that hopefully that will happen. But a lot of pushback has been given to the notion that the U.S. is going to withdraw from Afghanistan, and there will continue to be pushback. And one of the big claims, again, mostly from the liberal wing of the political spectrum that you'll hear, is that we need to have troops on the ground in Afghanistan to protect women's rights from the Taliban. That without U.S. boots on the ground, women are going to be left to their own devices, and that their rights are going to be extinguished. What, of course, this ignores is that, and this is according to Time Magazine, Afghanistan currently ranks at the very bottom, last for women's rights in the world, with U.S. troops on the ground. That is to say that U.S. troops, after 20 years, have not helped women in Afghanistan. That was never the point of being in Afghanistan. This also ignores the fact that it was the U.S. that originally overthrew a secular government by supporting jihadists, the Mujahideen, in Afghanistan beginning in June of 1979. The Mujahideen, led in part by a guy named Osama bin Laden, was supported by the U.S. To overthrow this secular government and ultimately was successful in doing that, and that gave rise to the Taliban, which has oppressed women. But none of that would have happened without the U.S. intervention, and women's rights were actually improving under the secular government that the U.S.-backed Mujahideen helped overthrow. Now, we are told, and this is a very important fact, which not a lot of people know necessarily, we were originally told that the U.S. backed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in order to counter the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. That is to say that it was in response to the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. Well, we found out proof positive years later that this was a lie. Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski, would later admit that no, the U.S. was backing the Mujahideen 6 months before the Russians intervened, and did so in order not to stop or halt or prevent a Russian invasion, but to bring about a Russian invasion. He knew that having jihadists take power in Afghanistan on the Soviet border would be unacceptable to the Soviet Union, and that if the U.S. backed these Mujahideen forces, the Soviet Union would intervene to defend the socialist government in Afghanistan, which is what exactly happened. Brzezinski's desire for doing this had nothing to do with helping Afghanistan or the women of Afghanistan. It was all about giving, and this is in the words of Brzezinski, giving Russia its own Vietnam. This was about drawing the Soviets into Afghanistan so that they would be bogged down in a costly war that would undermine the Soviet Union, which it did. This was effective from Brzezinski's point of view. Of course, in the meantime, he sacrificed Afghanistan in order to do that. Afghanistan has never been the same. It's a disaster. But the important thing to recognize is these claims that somehow the U.S. troops are there to protect Afghan women and to improve human rights and democracy is a joke, given the historic context of the U.S. involvement there. The other thing you have to realize is that at the time the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban, for all of its many faults, had effectively eradicated most of the heroin production and poppy production in Afghanistan. In fact, there's a New York Times and other articles from the summer of 2001, before the U.S. invades, saying just that the Taliban had gotten, heroin production down to almost zero before the U.S. invaded. Well, fast forward past the U.S. invasion, and to this day, Afghanistan now produces 85% of the world's heroin. And so again, which by the way is hurting Afghanis, because many Afghanis, including women and young women, are becoming addicted to heroin that's being produced in Afghanistan. Again, all of this could be traced back to the U.S. invasion of 2001, which, like most of the U.S. invasions of the last decades, destabilized a country probably beyond repair, and allowed for the production and exportation of drugs. Now, of course, some people might say, well, how could that have happened? The U.S. has boots on the ground there. The CIA is there. The DEA is there, the Drug Enforcement Agency. How could they have allowed this to happen? Are they that incompetent? Or maybe they wanted it to happen, right? Because we do know the CIA, during different conflicts, has made money through the heroin trade, through the cocaine trade. Maybe this was all according to plan. I can't prove that, and so I won't put that forth as a proof positive fact, but it's an interesting question to ask. Regardless, we know what happened. Afghanistan became a major producer of heroin, and of course that has also hurt our own U.S. population, which has a huge problem with opiate addiction, as I think everyone knows. And so as we approach this new date to withdraw the U.S. troops from Afghanistan after 20 years, it's important to keep all these things in mind, because you will hear often, and I hear it often, I'm in particular on NPR, which I listen to all the time, you're going to hear people wringing their hands about the plight of women in Afghanistan. You're going to hear about women's soccer leagues in Afghanistan, which do exist, which are great things. But in the context of pundits trying to convince you that the U.S. forces need to stay to protect those women, when in fact, again, the military hasn't done that, won't do that. It's not in the nature of any military to do that sort of thing. As I mentioned in one chapter of this book, No More War, the U.S. military is not a feminist organization, right? Though one might think so, given, again, the really the propaganda around this. And one proof positive evidence of this is the horrible sexual abuse committed within the U.S. military itself mostly by male soldiers against their female comrades in arms. About 1 out of 3 female soldiers report serious acts of sexual harassment by their male counterparts, including forcible rape. So the idea that somehow the U.S. military, which can't even police itself when it comes to women's rights, is somehow going around the world protecting women's rights is frankly a cruel joke. And people need to be serious when they think about these issues and about war and what war means to people on the ground, and to give up this notion that somehow, again, the U.S. is going around the world defending feminist goals and human rights. It doesn't happen. It won't happen. And the sooner we give up that ghost, the sooner we're going to have a sane foreign policy. So if you get a chance, pick up my book, No More War, How the West Violates International Law by Using, quote, humanitarian, unquote, intervention to advance economic and strategic interests. And in the meantime, be well, be safe, and you've been watching Voice of the Voiceless with me, Dan Kovalik. Good day.